This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here, we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. Well, we're really excited to get to speak to Elizabeth Graver today. Elizabeth is a novelist and professor of creative writing at Boston College, where she is co-director of the Creative Writing Concentration, where she teaches fiction and nonfiction writing workshops, including advanced fiction workshop, writing about place, and writing across cultures. Her most recent novel, which is her fifth, is Cantica, which was inspired by her grandmother, Rebecca, who was born into a Sephardic Jewish family in Istanbul and whose shape-shifting life journey took her to Spain, Cuba, and New York. Cantica was awarded several prizes, including the Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction and the National Jewish Book Award. It was named a Best Historical Fiction Book of 2023 and a Notable Book of the Year by the New York Times, and a Best Book of the Year by NPR, Lilith, and Libby, and was translated into German and Turkish. Her work has been anthologized, and she's received fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Arts, the MacDowell Colony, the Yaddo Foundation, and the Guggenheim Foundation. So welcome, Elizabeth. So good to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to ask you about this most recent book, which, by the way, I'm not sure if I even pronounced totally correctly, but maybe you'll say it later on. In part because it seems like this could have been a work of creative nonfiction. It's, kind of based on a family history, it sounds, and that's something that some of my colleagues in history work on. And I wonder if you were ever considering it as something that you would write in nonfiction, or if you tried that at all with it.
Sure, that's a great question. I call it Cantica, by the way, but people who speak Ladino or Spanish might say it differently, so you can pronounce it however you want. The book has a lot of languages in it.
Yeah.
So the genre was quite interesting. I mean, I think I did more or less set out to think I was going to write it as fiction, partly because I'm a novelist, and then for some other reasons that became clearer along the way. I'm actually writing a nonfiction book now, so I don't feel wedded to these genres at all. But I was very drawn to the real in it. I had, when I was 21, decades ago, interviewed my grandmother telling stories, and I had these sort of seeds of recordings, just a couple hours. And I had done it at the time, partly because she was aging, and I wanted to be able to have that opportunity to sit down with her and have her feel that her story was important, but partly because I think I also knew it was really interesting in some way that I might want to do something with eventually. So those sat around for a long time, and obviously they're nonfiction. It's her life, although she was also a big embroiderer and storyteller and not totally reliable all the time in some great ways, I think. And so when I decided finally, for a bunch of complicated reasons, I think, to finally turn to this story, I thought about would I want to do it as nonfiction, but there were a few things that made me tip towards fiction. One was that she had died decades before at that point, and so wasn't accessible in terms of my asking her direct questions, although some other family members were, and I really relied on them. Another was that I love inner life, and I wanted increasingly, as I got further into imagining this story, to be able to do things like enter the consciousness of my great-grandfather, Alberto Cohen, a man I never met, a man my mother never met. He was born in Turkey in the former Ottoman Empire and died in Spain and had a really interesting life. And I knew about 5 things about him. But once I got going, I was like, I don't want to just write about him and be signaling all the gaps all the time. I actually want to be walking in his steps and inside his head with that kind of intimacy that fiction can allow. And then the third reason, I think, is that I didn't want myself to be in it, which is something I'm interrogating in what I'm writing now, which I actually am in. But I kept kind of thinking, I don't want to say I couldn't find this, or here I am, the granddaughter walking these streets, even though there is a story there and it's kind of an interesting one. But I wanted to kind of step back and have whatever self exists in the novel, because of course everything we write has ourselves in it, be kind of braided through and submerged in a certain way. And so I felt like if I did it as nonfiction, I didn't want to write like a straight history. It would have been a kind of memoir, that there would have had to be the kind of granddaughter on the quest, which is something I get a little impatient with in a lot of books, that strand. I just didn't want to do it. It didn't feel compelling enough. But that said, it's a weird novel, right? So I did make a decision to use real family photographs. I used a whole bunch of real names. I got permission from anybody who was still living. The acknowledgments make all of that very clear. So I view it really as, it's not a conventional novel. I recently had the great pleasure of inviting the French writer Anne Burest to speak at Boston College. Have you read her work, The
No,
Postcard?
no.
She wrote a really interesting novel called The Postcard, and she and her sister, Claire Burest, wrote a novel called Gabrielle about their great grandmother. And both these novels are based on family history very closely. Both of them actually have a character based on Anne in it, but they're fiction. And she came up with a term, she calls it le vrai roman, or the true novel, that I was suddenly like, that's what I'm doing. It's not actually a straight novel. It's straddling. And it really mattered to me to have those photographs and to have them be real and to kind of invite the reader in various ways, somewhat oblique ways, I think, at times, to kind of trouble that boundary. So I sort of may have tried to have it both ways.
Mm. One of the things that I noticed as a historian is the way the book is organized around these years, like 1907, I think is maybe the first date, and then we end in 1950. And that organization made me wonder if the history was really guiding your writing. Was that always the way you were going to do it, or did you find it helpful to be thinking about, all right, what would have changed by the time we jumped to 1934 and what was going on politically and culturally in the 40s?
So those dates, definitely the wider history impacted me, as did the personal history as I gleaned it. I mean, when I did research, it was a mix. I read a lot of history. I relied on some incredible historians, some of whom I'm sure you know their work, like Sarah Abrevaya Stein or Devin Narr, Aaron Rodriguez, people who do Mikhail Friedman, people who do Sephardic history, basically, kind of Ottoman Empire and Ladino and all of that. It matters to me hugely to get it right. Like, I don't want a historian, or almost even worse, someone who lived through that period, to be like, wait, that's the wrong date. Like, I'm a really obsessive fact checker, even though it's fiction. But I also was really relying on what I knew, and sometimes invented a little bit because I didn't have enough, like the exact dates, for example, when my family left Turkey and moved, quote, back to Spain. I know the year. I don't know the exact mechanism. So I made up that Alberto goes to this refugee office. You know, I sort of grabbed things from various records and then invented some things too. But interestingly, and part of what interests me about these literatures of migration is that the personal histories and the historical histories are incredibly tightly woven. So, for example, the reason my grandmother had to go to Cuba, which is one of the locations. The book is structured around dates and locations. So it goes Istanbul, or Constantinople, as it was called then in her community, Barcelona, Cuba, New York. And the reason there's Cuba is both because she went there, and I found the ship's manifest, and I found the stationery from the hotel she stayed on, but also because of immigration laws, right? So she needed to get out, felt she needed to get out of Spain at that time, both because of what was happening with the Nazis rising and Hitler rising in Europe, but also the Spanish Civil War and a lot of other things in the 1930s. And she wanted to get into the US, but the only way she could get into the US was by going to Cuba and meeting the man who she ended up marrying, my grandfather, in an arranged marriage. And the reason they had to go to Cuba was because of the very prohibitive 1924 Anti-Immigration Act. So you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like she really did go then, but the reason she went then and could only get to the US through marrying someone who she just met by way of Cuba was because of these bigger historical forces. So that has just become increasingly really interesting to me, like how these personal canvases and these choices or lack of choices or exigencies play out in the context of these of legislation and boundaries and laws and bigger movements. But my approach is always sort of granular through the lived life of the individual. But I need to know the history, and I'm really interested in how, even if the person at that moment isn't backing up, they're being moved around by history, like we all are.
Yeah, about that marriage that you described, the second marriage for Rebecca, its nature, it's kind of passionate, and her independence, her telling him, "You didn't marry a dish rag type of person, like, I'm gonna stand up to you." Those sorts of inner details, were those things you had heard, or is that you creating a persona and a couple there?
So again, it's a mix. Yes. I mean, I witnessed my grandparents. I knew them well. They were passionate. They were fiery. They used to joke that she was a Cohen and he was a Levy, and the kings and the priests, and like there's going to be tension.
Right.
So they really loved each other. And it was actually a really good marriage. And she'd had a terrible first marriage, and he'd lost his first wife in childbirth. So they'd come through really tragedy before they met. And I would see them, and they were interesting as grandparents because they were unusual in certain ways. My grandmother was very bodily open. She was very kind of sexy. She was very overt in lots of ways. She would talk to me about having a passionate relationship. So I knew all that, but
Yeah.
that's different than what I actually wrote, which is like I wrote about this fictional, but based on them couple, like having sex, like obviously, thank God I didn't
Right.
witness. That's where I sort of crossed a threshold. And at times it felt a little uncomfortable, but part of me was like, if I want to show people in all of their lived complexity, of course they had sex. And it seems really important. And I do actually feel, particularly with my grandmother, and my cousins and mother and sibling have agreed with me, thank God, that there was almost an implicit permission in the kind of person she was. That she didn't shy away from things. And I also felt with her that she never really got the voice or the understanding or the attention that she yearned for, because she had these performative qualities. She was very talented. She'd grown up rather privileged, then she lost everything. And so, in a certain way, I felt like this isn't a literary reason, it's really a personal reason, but I felt this sort of sense of, here you go. I am like putting you right out here. Like it's your time. And so that actually felt ethically okay in a way that if she had been different, I might have had different kinds of hesitations.
Yeah, and it did make the book so much better that it had this very realistic messiness, the feelings of envy, resentment, anger within a family that are so natural. And there was also love there, but it was so satisfying to have it not be so perfect all the time.
Yeah, that was really important to me. And I have I'm teaching a course right now called Writing the Family Past and Present. And a lot of my students are writing about their grandparents. And I'm having to gently coax them to be like, I'm sure she was a wonderful woman, but like, what about this little strand right here where you say she had her sorrows, or you say and it's not that I'm kind of wanting them to exploit trauma in any way, but just that people are really complicated. And when you write about your own family, there's a tendency to censor and to kind of idealize. And I was very clear that I didn't want to do that, because I don't think that actually makes for good art, but I also don't think it does justice to the person.
Yeah. You mentioned the inclusion of family photographs. And I was actually wondering, there was a little film that was mentioned. I think it might have been made in the 20s. Was that something that actually existed?
Yeah, that was crazy. I mean, I found that when I was doing research. So I was just poking around. I had a fellowship at Brandeis, at the Hadassah Brandeis Women's Research Center. I might be getting the name slightly wrong, but and there's a Jewish film archive in Waltham connected to Brandeis, and I was just poking around looking for kind of local images, really, of Sephardic life in the Ottoman Empire, and I found this 1929 film 13 minutes, very jagged. Films were new. And I was watching it, and at about 5 minutes in, I came upon, it said in subtitles, it's a silent film. There's even a little Jewish oratory in Barcelona. And then there was an image, and I was like, I swear to God, that's my great grandfather, because I had pictures. And then it cut to two little boys and a woman, a bunch of people in the garden. I knew he was a big gardener. And one of the little boys had this halo of blonde hair, kind of frizzy hair. And I thought, I think that's my grandmother and my Uncle David and my Uncle Albert. And my Uncle David was still alive. So I sent it to him, and he was in his 90s. He died sadly before the book came out, but helped me hugely and is a named character in it. And he called me and was just like, holy shit, like, what is that? Where did you find that? Because he's toddling across the frame. He's 2 years old.
Wow.
But then what became more interesting and also more disturbing is that when I researched the film, it turns out that the filmmaker, whose name is Jimenez Caballero, Mikkel Friedman has written about him, the historian, was this very creepy man who was kind of obsessed with Jews in the interest of the kind of fading lost empire of Spain and trying to get the Sephardic Jews in the hinterlands and the kind of former colonies to do the work of the empire or lost empire. And then when Hitler came to power, he totally turned and became a fascist. So suddenly I had this really complicated guy having walked in and filmed my family. And that was a really hard section to write because he threatened to take over. I thought about writing an essay about him because I'm really interested in that moment of contact. Like, what does it mean? Like, this was a gift for me. I get to see them. It was a gift for my uncle, but it was really creepy. And the whole film is actually pretty anthropologically bizarre and creepy. So I had a longer chapter, and my editor said, we're not going to get rid of him. This is fascinating, but he's threatening to take over the book. You need to pull it closer to the family. And so I really wrestled with how to include that. So that was a research find that was both fabulous and kind of artistically and aesthetically and even politically in certain ways, because it was so complicated that his context hard for me to figure out.
Yeah, what a dream find.
Yeah.
The way you inhabit so many different kinds of characters is really striking and satisfying for the reader. And I did wonder about your process for doing this. I did a lot of theater earlier in my life, and I guess I think of this part of fiction as similar in terms of getting into character. I'm just wondering if you're able to explain it to outsiders, what that's like for you to get into these different characters' hearts and minds.
I like your theater analogy. I mean, I always wanted to do theater, but I was much too shy and awkward. So I would be like the, 12th girl in the chorus. But I did love that kind of imaginative leap. What I did do as a child, which I actually think is very connected to how I write character, is I played these extraordinarily elaborate, mostly with my best friend Nancy, imaginary games, and really won for my whole childhood, where we had a farm and many children. And, so that kind of, where does that come from? I don't know. It feels extremely natural to me to just kind of shift from self into imagined other. It's just, I've been doing it since I was a tiny girl,
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what I feel like, I almost sometimes feel like, oh my God, I've gotten away with this amazing thing I get to play as a grown up. I mean, it's also a lot of work, right? Like, it's endless labor to sort of figure out, put it in a form.
Mm-hmm.
But that moment of kind of jumping and inhabiting another voice and that fluidity feels really natural to me. Why? I mean, it's just kind of imagined. I think it's natural to many people, but some people, for whatever reason, exercise it more. And often it goes away in adulthood. I mean, I hope it hasn't for you. Maybe have you kept it up in your various We're doing.
Yeah, no, I think I sometimes do fiction writing, and I totally relate to I think for me it was with Barbies. A friend and I created this sort of whole universe. And then
Yeah.
once I discovered that people could get divorced and then the family could keep on sort of increasing people, that allowed me to create, yeah, really big universe.
I love that link, but somebody should write an anthology about the link between childhood imaginary play and what we do now, because I
Yeah.
think it's really strong and fascinating.
Yeah. There's a line early in the novel about the main character, Rebecca Levy, who's grown up in Istanbul and later in her life she comes to the US. You write that she will encounter Jews for whom the Sabbath is a solemn, davening affair, no apricots and syrup or pomegranates with their bloody pearls, just gefilte fish trembling in slime. It's a great line. I think the New York Times review of your book also cited it, but it made me think wonder if part of your work with this novel was finding these, or actually being able to show very vividly these differences between most Americans' perceptions or stereotypes of Jews and the very dazzling Sephardic experience of your family and of this fictional Sephardic family. That's part of the fun for the reader, is to discover that this family saga is actually so different and magnificent compared to what many people think of as the Ashkenazic experience.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think I set off thinking, I didn't have an agenda at all. It was just the story that I was writing that came from my family, and half my family's Ashkenazi. So I actually had, my father's side is Ashkenazi. So I had both. I had the gefilte fish grandma too,
Yeah.
writing about them now. And I don't think one is better than the other. I mean, I do actually prefer the Mediterranean Sephardic food, but there's some good, I like a good borscht. So I was aware in my own lived experience of the fact that, for example, when my parents first met, and my mother was Sephardic and my dad was Ashkenazi, my mother's side, the side in Kentika, were just thrilled that their daughter, who was a kind of leftist, rebellious intellectual, had like met a Jewish guy. Like that was enough for them, and they knew who, you can't be Jewish in America without seeing or being part of. They were part of a synagogue that was primarily Ashkenazi, but my father's mother, who lived in Co-op City in the Bronx, in a very kind of a world surrounded by her sisters and Yiddish, and a much more self-enclosed world in certain ways, was suspicious that my mother wasn't really Jewish. She was like, what is this? Like, what does she speak? Because my mother's first language was Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. I mean, she was fluent in English too, but her food was different, and there were a lot of significant differences. So I did grow up with that, kind of being aware of that they were all, and I was raised extremely secular, but seeing different ways of Judaism being enacted and embodied on the two sides of my family. I think as I started to research the book and get to know people working in the field, it became even clearer to me that there weren't very many stories, especially fiction, about the Sephardic experience. And I met all these incredible people doing, Ladino music. And I've had these great collaborations. And Ladino in particular, I just, I learned a little, not enough, but I just think it's this beautiful disappearing language filled with folklore and steeped with wisdom. And I love the spellings. And so I love that the title of the book is Cantica, means song in Ladino. And it's a weird word. And I was a little surprised that my publisher let it fly. My editor loved it. And then she said, now we have to get it past marketing and, all of the layers. And I kept coming up with other kind of comp titles like Pachinko or
Right.
which are about other cultures,
Mhm.
Haitian and Korean American, but take that kind of defamiliarized, a word that someone from those worlds will immediately have a spark of recognition, but lots of people won't. And there's this sort of invitation to translation and kind of legibility that the book does for you, even as there's also like a little moment, maybe for some readers, of estrangement, which also interests me. So that kind of speaking to something that's beautiful and interesting and valuable and in danger of being lost, but also acknowledging in certain ways that not everybody is going to know about it. So you need to kind of help people along, but also not baby them. Like, I'm interested in not always translating directly, all of that was part of the pleasure, a new pleasure for me, because I'd never encountered any of that in my work. In my
Mhm.
reading, I had a huge amount, but not as a writer.
You mentioned that your editor was okay with the Ladino name, the title, and I'm just curious, did the Sephardiness of it all, did you encounter any resistance from editor or press or agent, or did you find that there's actually a real appetite for this now?
I think everybody, I didn't encounter any resistance, but I think all of us were a little surprised at the level of appetite.
Mhm.
Like my book, just, the Jewish Book Council, for example, was like, I got way more invitations than I could accept.
Mhm.
So hopefully it's because it's a good book, but I don't think that's the whole thing. I think it's partly that it's actually a different story, that it's a story that people are hungry to learn more about. So I don't think we quite anticipated that, but it's been lovely.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds great. I also noted that you teach as well. In fact, it sounds like you were co-directing this writing center. And I'm just curious how the creative writing and the teaching works for you, especially because I guess I always assume with fiction writers that you like really need to inhabit that fictional world. And there's something about teaching that I find so grounding and brings me back to really the everydayness of grading and students needing and wanting things. Do these two things, writing fiction and teaching, go well together for you?
I mean, the broad answer is yes, for a bunch of reasons. One, I really like teaching. I'm pretty social. I like being in rooms with people and talking about ideas. I like young people. I also like having a steady paycheck. I mean, I don't actually want to be having my income depend on my writing, both because that's a tough road, but even more because I like to take my time and write into kind of often bold and experimental modes that might not necessarily yield money. They do sometimes, but I don't, I really don't, I wouldn't want to set things up that way. I tried right out of college being kind of a freelance writer and journalist, and I'm also just too constitutionally anxious. Like the checks take months to arrive, and it's just not, it wasn't a good setup for my creative life.
Mhm.
So, and then I also really, one of the kind of great gifts of my job is getting to design these courses that follow my passions without, I'm conscious of not taking the students down some niche interest that, I'm not teaching like the Sephardic archive at my Jesuit university. But I'm very open with kind of my own passions and work. Like right now, I'm teaching this course called Writing a Nonfiction Undergrad Workshop, Writing the Family Past and Present. And we're in and out of archives. And they're doing sort of similar work to some of the work I'm doing. And that helps me think through what I'm doing. But it's also just really fun to kind of see their stories, and they're from a wide range of places and backgrounds. So that's great. The time is always a challenge. Even though I have a, luxuriously good tenured job, I'm always struggling to find enough time to go deep. So, I apply for grants. I never teach in the summer. I try really, really hard to clear out Fridays, during the year, with some success. I also care about being a good teacher, so I can't always do it. But I am not a writer. I'm not one of these people who gets up every morning at 4 a.m. and writes. And I have learned over the years to set things aside for chunks of time. I also have two kids. They're young adults now, but I care about all of these things.
Mhm.
I remember once inviting Grace Paley years and years ago to BC, and she was, unbelievably busy because she arrived, did her thing, and then was, I think, running off to Washington to get arrested at a protest. And I said to her something like, "Is this hard? Like you're doing all these different things?" And she was like, "It's not hard. It's great. Like I love everything I'm doing. Like it's okay that when I'm doing one thing, I'm not doing the other thing because." You have one life. And if I always knew I wanted to write, and I always knew I wanted to have kids. And all three things feel kind of important in ways that, almost increasingly as I get older and see what's happening in the world, teaching feels important.
Yeah. You mentioned that you're working on something nonfiction now. How did this come about?
So I think I've been inching closer and closer to nonfiction. So my novel before Cantica was called The End of the Point, and it was loosely inspired by my stories around my husband's family. but with many more name changes, and it's more fictional than Cantica. It doesn't have photos. And then Cantica is, I would say, a true novel. And somehow, once I went down this family history realm and was thinking throughout writing Cantica of the kind of parallel lives of the other side of my family, I got really interested in that. It's a very different story. But I also, the reason I'm doing it as nonfiction is because the center of it is my father. He died in 2010. And while he was alive, he had a long, very difficult illness at the end of his life. I did these writing prompts with him. He was an English professor, but not a creative writer. And so the prompts are kind of the heart of it. And I'm writing about myself and my relationship with him in a much, much more overt way than I ever have, except in occasional essays, put myself at the center. So it feels risky, I have to say. I think fiction, one of the things fiction does is it allows me to hide. It allows me to kind of explore things that I feel really passionate about without feeling like I'm exposing my direct self. And I'm kind of like, I don't know, it's time to try something new. Why not?
Mhm.
So, but it's hard.
Yeah, I know sometimes I've heard that trade press editors sometimes want you to stick with a thing that was just successful. So I don't know if you have an editor who's just more open to you going where your spirit leads you, or if there's any pressure to do another novel.
I have had that pressure in the past and I resist it and I don't write a contract because of that. So I'm not asking permission. I'm just doing my work.
Hmm.
I mean, I have an agent, I have a new agent actually who I love and she seems really excited. So, but I'm not, you can with a nonfiction book, as I'm sure you know, go out early and try to get a contract. And I'm not doing that. That's another reason I'm grateful for my job. Like, I don't want someone to say to me, why don't you turn this into a novel? Or, why don't you take away this strand? Like, I'm very open to criticism and I have a huge amount to figure out, but I don't want it to be market driven, those decisions.
I'm curious then, since we've talked with many writers who've gone between trade and academic, are you doing a nonfiction book proposal that an agent might then shop? Or it sounds like you're actually just kind of maybe writing the book?
I don't want to do a proposal because I don't want a deadline and I don't want someone to tell me what to do.
Yeah.
The money would be nice, but I just feel like, and it's a very personal book. It's much more memoir like. It's close to fiction in certain ways. It's not like a biography and it has elements of those things, but it's an experimental book in various ways. So no, I mean, I talked to Emily, my agent, about the possibility. And she said, my gut feeling is you should just write it. What do you think? And I said, that's my gut feeling too. So that's what I'm doing.
Great. And does that mean, just because I feel like our listeners are often wondering how things work with agents, is the agent likely to then be able to shop it to editors the way she'd shop a book proposal? Or are you thinking this might be for an academic press?
I don't think it'll be for an academic press.
Hmm.
No, I think I picture it being shopped the way I don't know about a book proposal because I've never done that, but the way she would shop a novel,
Hmm.
that it's just another, I don't view these genre divisions as that important. Although publisher might, I don't know where it'll end up.
Yeah.
It could end up at a smaller press because it's a kind of somewhat odd book, but Cantica also did quite well. So, and I've all, my first book was a story collection published by University of Pittsburgh because it was through a contest, the Drew Hines Prize. Other than that, I've always been published by Big Five presses,
Hmm.
which are wonderful in lots of ways and also have some limitations if you're a smaller book on a big list or inside a
Hmm.
big corporation. But I have mostly had really good experiences. So, I don't know. I try really hard. It's hard, but to kind of bracket, set aside where it's going to land, and with some confidence at this point that it will land somewhere good.
Yeah.
But everything changes so quickly. Editors can go. My book was published by this very, very beautiful imprint of Holt called Metropolitan Books. And my editor, Reva Hockerman, was one of the founders of it. And they take lots of risks and publish a lot of it was almost like a boutique small house inside a big house. And it doesn't exist anymore.
Wow.
So Riva has moved over to the bigger Holt, and my book still says Metropolitan on it, but it's nested inside. Holt is who handles it now, which is a great publisher. I had actually been there before, but it's really terrible that this imprint, which was something different, was doing different things that and had more kind of autonomy and less commercial kind of drive. I mean, she also publishes, one of Riva's authors, Nathan Thrall, recently got the Pulitzer Prize. A lot of these books land really well, but she takes risks. So I was really lucky to end up with her. And it's terrible that she still has her job, but the beautiful, smaller kind of entity that she and her colleague had created is gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Since you're teaching creative writing, Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you about AI. This is something that scholars wonder, I think, about our own work, but of course also with our students. And I'm wondering if you've noticed how, if students are able to use AI in a helpful way, because you, of course, have students who actually, I'm assuming many of them really want to become better writers. That's why they're in your classes. Are you finding anything good about AI, or what have you noticed?
It's a great subject. It's one I really have been almost like in almost a kind of phobic way not engaging with, and I really need to. I mean, in the class, this family class that I mentioned, it doesn't come up that much because these are advanced undergraduate and graduate students, and even several people. There's a woman in her 60s who's in this BC Companions Returning Adults program, and they're just obsessed with their own family histories and wanting to do archival research. There are things like on ancestry.com, you can kind of, once you've assembled a bunch of things about your relative, here's her census. She lived on this street in 1930. She was a bookkeeper. She took in boarders, whatever. You can tell an incredible amount from these archival documents, as I'm sure you know. And then it'll say, do you want us to give you a little AI story? And I've clicked on them. They're sort of cool. I don't totally trust them. Like, I think, first of all, censuses are filled with errors, but also I don't trust AI. I think it's, my husband is a civil rights lawyer and he's been playing with it, and it makes up cases, it makes up precedents. So if you're writing nonfiction and really worried about the truth, I have a lot of worry about it. But I also, I guess, in that kind of class, maybe I'm naive. I don't feel like they want AI to be writing their essays for them. However, in the spring, I'm going to be teaching we all teach in our core also, a required course for first year multilingual students that most of them don't particularly want to be there. We have a big core. And in that course, I think it's going to be a different story. These are econ majors. These are very busy young people with a lot of pressures on their time. And a few of them will get really into literature, but a lot of them won't. So I have a lot to learn, but I actually think I'm going to be doing things like in-class reading and
Yeah.
oral stuff to just, but I think really what I feel like I'm going to need to do is talk to them and not be closed to their viewpoint, but try to talk to them about what is it that happens in your mind and in your soul when you are engaging with ideas and writing something and working through a process where mostly it's your brain that's the tool. Because if we lose that as a valuable thing, like, why go to college? Like so how to handle that, I don't know. I just proposed a new course for next year on letter writing for seniors, this capstone program, because I was like, the letter is a really personal thing. And there, I think I would get AI to like, let's write a letter of complaint and then let's see what it looks like and write our own, kind of use it a little bit as a comparative tool to see what it can do that's useful and what it can't do that's deep and personal and particular and like your own fingerprint.
So it sounds like you are open to kind of using it and seeing sort of in the laboratory of the classroom, what can it do? What do we find missing?
A little bit. I don't want it to take over, but yes, I mean, I think I have to learn more, but my feeling is you sort of have to. And also, I don't want to be a Luddite. Like, I'm sure there's ways. I mean, I do so much research. I rely on these kind of different forms of artificial intelligence to track and down and collate and dredge things up for me all the time. So, but I also have a very strong feeling that kind of the work of particularly a creative writer, but really any intellectual, involves kind of the mind and the heart in a very kind of unmechanized way, engaging with the world. And so it feels like attention.
Yeah. Because you are in classes where students, it sounds like at least some of the classes students are inspired to write creatively, want to become better writers. Are there things that you wish that the rest of us humanities professors were doing in our classrooms, art, or our assignments, or the way we grade to help students more become better writers, feel inspired, or realize the importance of it? Because we are in this moment when so many of us are scared that students don't even understand why they should care about becoming better writers.
Well, that's a great big question. I mean, I love process-based writing. So any class where students are allowed to kind of think on paper and come up with drafts, which I know is harder in some classrooms and course topics than others. But to me, and any kind of pedagogical model that privileges the process of finding out what you think and not having the first thing that is put on the page be the thing is important. It also is a really good way to push against plagiarism and kind of receive notions, because you get to actually go through the steps and see them and have conversations along the way. So that's how I do almost all my teaching, no matter what kind of, whether it's a lit class or a workshop. I think the workshop model of process and kind of, and I think it also helps students who have writer's block or a lot of anxiety be willing to make mistakes and kind of have a mess right in front of them that is filled with potential and that isn't going to kind of be locked down as a version or a graded thing. So that's one way. But I love the work that historians do. I mean, I love material culture. I have great colleagues at BC, one of whom actually, Sylvia Sellers Garcia, is also a novelist in the history department. So I love all of those intersections, and I'm always really interested in kind of thinking collaboratively or noticing what's happening in adjacent fields.
hmm Because you do work in a college, and it sounds like you have some colleagues, or at least this one who's a historian and also is a novelist. I wonder if you have any advice or thoughts for historians, other scholars who wonder, can my research work as fiction or more creatively? Just because it seemed like some of the ingredients of Cantica, could have been the kind of sources that scholars would also have at their disposal. And, maybe they're wondering, how do I think about, could this become fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think lots of it could become fiction, and I certainly have talked to historians that I encountered through the writing of Cantica who've said to me, "I'm thinking of writing a YA novel," or a lot of many of us have other kind of genres or ideas or pursuits, kind of somewhere in the background. Again, as you can probably tell from what I said earlier, I don't feel that strongly about genre. So whether it's fiction or true fiction or kind of immersive history that animates, I would never feel like it was up. I wouldn't even have an opinion on that. I think the project itself and what people want to do with it just would determine that. But, like you said, you write a little fiction and you have this acting experience. People have their own ways of doing it. I guess my feeling is just, as a writer myself and as a teacher or colleague to people trying different things, try it, be bold. One of my closest friends is a historian, and she has now retired from teaching, and she's writing creative nonfiction. And it's just so fun to watch her, kind of taking those steps. And it doesn't feel like a big jump to me.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it would feel like a bigger jump if I suddenly was like, I needed to write a history of the Sephardic people of Turkey in the 20th century, then I would just like, oh my God, I don't have a PhD in history. But the other direction, as long as you're patient and kind of And reading lots of things that are doing the sorts of things that you're doing. I've been reading a really interesting writer called Leah Yupi, who's originally from Albania. And she has a book called Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, and a new one that I'm reading in galleys called Indignity, A Life Reimagined. And she's a really interesting example. You could interview her maybe. She's in England, but she's a professor of political theory. And the first book is about her childhood in communist and then after the fall of communism, Albania, but it's also filled with ideas. And then the next one's about her grandmother, who was born in Salonika or Thessaloniki in the former Ottoman Empire. And it has these chunks that are fiction, even though the genre is nonfiction, as it's labeled. But again, this is just totally igniting my interest in those blurry zones.
Yeah. There's two questions that we ask all guests, and one is if there's something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career.
I think for me, in terms of process, it has been useful to understand that I can never figure out the structure of a book until I've written through it once, and that it's going to be wrong, like that it's going to have architectural massive trouble. And that happened with my first novel, Unraveling, and I took it back and worked on it for another year or two. And it's happened with almost every other book since. But I think when I was really young with Unraveling, I thought, oh, I figured it out now. And now next time I'll know how to do it. And it's just not true. And some of that is the way I work, that I don't outline and that I'm very much like tunneling in a process of discovery. Like I just need my unconscious to be, or subconscious to be leading me. And so an outline would just be the death of the project to me. It would just make me bored, like paint by number.
Right.
But some of it is just that I think I've learned that over time, I need to be willing to make mistakes and that it's going to take a while. That's the other reason I don't like writing on contract. Like and why I like having a day job. So for Cantica, for example, the last third was totally different when I thought I might be done. It didn't have Luna, a very central character, as a point of view character. It had a character inspired by my grandfather's point of view, and it didn't work. And I had to write through it. I put a lot of energy into it, but eventually I was like, doesn't work. Like, throw it away. So that sense, it's a lot to ask when I tell my students, oh, this novel took me 8 years. They just look horrified. But I love taking my time and I love my process, actually, although it does take a lot of patience. So I think if I had known, I think I had a little bit of a sense early on of like, you need to know where you're going with a novel. It's plot driven. You need to kind of understand what its structure is, and that letting go of that and kind of being able to inhabit that uncertainty has been freeing for me.
So for you, is that one of those, as I write, I find where I'm going kind of experiences?
Yeah, and in very complicated ways with these increasingly complicated books. I find where I'm going partly because suddenly I find about a filmmaker who, the research, I don't do all the research and then write. It's a process that's happening all at the same time. So I can't predict, partly because I don't know what I'm going to find.
Yeah.
That's what's so incredibly fun, which is that there are just these discoveries. Like I'll come, something will pop up and I'll be like, oh, now I'm going to turn that way. But it also means that there's a lot of realignment that has to happen because there's these kind of bits that don't fit or that need to be integrated or discarded.
Yeah. The other question we ask is if there's a writing practice or habit that is working for you.
So something I have always done through many different life changes, even when my kids were little, is get away. And I'm lucky because I have a partner who is a great dad and I have a job that gives me time to do this. But whether it's kind of 2 days with my friend Bridget, the historian I mentioned, where we get a, Airbnb in Provincetown cheap in the off season, or I've gone to lots of artist residencies like McDowell and Yaddo for longer stretches, or sometimes I've gone for little research trips. For me, it's really important in the midst of juggling teaching and for a long time parenting and writing to take time that's where the writing or the research for the writing, which is sometimes also incredible travel, is totally at the center. And to prioritize that and to kind of have, which I think particularly as a woman writer can be hard, or academic, to be like, this is what I'm doing. Like, I am going for 4 days. And unless there's like a major emergency, don't call. Or, that's, I mean, with my kids, I would, because when you leave your kids, that's different. But to sort of set aside that time. And I think partly for me, that's because I don't write every day. And I often, when I'm teaching, really devote so much energy to it that sometimes it feels really necessary to take that time. And it's amazing what I can get done when I'm in those states. Like, it almost feels like a fugue state. Like when I've had 2 or 3 weeks at a residency, the amount that I write and the kind of deep, creative, kind of receptive mode that those circumstances allow just feels like nothing else. Like, I can't duplicate it, even though, as you can see, I have like a nice study. I have good work. I'm lucky. I have good working conditions, but especially with our current world and texts, and like, there's so much stuff coming in. So I think I would say, however you can in the conditions of your life, like, claim and clear some space.
Yeah, that is really important. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. This was really fun and helpful.
It was great. I love your podcast.
Thank you.
Good luck with your fiction and your other work.
Thanks.
I'll keep an eye out.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.